This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Julia Wertz. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul, and we're two academics talking about comics.
And on this episode, Paul and I have a conversation with Julia Wertz. Her new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash, An Unconventional Illustrated History of New York City, came out earlier this month from Black Dog and Leventhal. But before we get to that conversation, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price. Sometimes 50% off of the cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right. At DCBS, you can find great discounts on comics and graphic novels. One way to take advantage of those great discounts is to check out the bundles that DCBS has every month. As of right now, we haven't seen the November bundles yet, but they're coming, and they're bound to be bundles at up to 50% off of Marvel, DC, Valiant, all kinds of bundles that offer really an incredible value. And at the same time, you can pre-order graphic novels from a variety of publishers, IDW and Top Shelf, and Dark Horse, and all kinds of stuff. So check out those discounts at Discount Comic Book Service.
That's right. You can't beat the discounts at Discount Comic Book Service, if for no other reason because discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. You got to go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, this was an enjoyable interview with Julia Wertz, and the second in as many weeks where we've talked to someone who has written a book about New York.
Yeah, and it was nice because I feel like you're referring to the chat we got to have with Roz Chast, which was also a lot of fun. Mm-hmm. We talk about that a little bit. We talk about Roz Chast with Julia a little bit. I think they're two books that are actually very complementary. And so it was great fun, and Julia was a delight to talk to.
Yeah, she was. And it's as the subtitle of the book indicates, it is an unconventional work, unconventional history, which is something that I particularly appreciated. In other words, with almost every history, you have some kind of narrative thread that is discernible. And even though there are thematic links here or there throughout Tenements, Towers, and Trash, for the most part, it's just a casual mentioning of various facets of New York and its history. And, she used the word hodgepodge to describe her work. And I think that that's a great way of approaching this new book.
Absolutely. And it's a very thoughtful hodgepodge.
Exactly.
And so folks who know her previous work, which is more autobiographical, I think there's a lot of the spirit of her perspective and her wit that come across in this history.
Yeah, and we talk about her previous work within the context of this new book. So let's go ahead and let our listeners hear what we talked about.
Yep, here we go.
We're pleased to have on the Comics Alternative Julia Wertz. Her new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash, An Unconventional Illustrated History of New York City, came out just recently from Black Dog and Leventhal publishers. Julia, welcome to the Comics Alternative.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. We're really excited to talk to you about Tenements, Towers, and Trash, an unconventional illustrated history of New York City. And I guess I get to start things off because I was lucky enough to you had an appearance at Pegasus Books in Berkeley last night, and I got to see that. That was really fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I like that shop. I like how they have everything set up. Yeah, it was actually the second place I ever did a reading, and I was talking to we got Tim who works there, and I don't really remember a whole lot, but I guess I just had like these little zines. And I showed up and I did my little zine reading, and it was about exactly 10 years ago. So it was nice to circle back and do my only Bay Area event at that place. So it's special to me.
Yeah. So and you're living in the Bay Area now, but those 10 years in between that you just mentioned, that was the time in New York?
Yes. Yeah. I was spent in Greenpoint in Brooklyn.
That's awesome. So, I mean, I think with the book Tenements, Towers, and Trash kind of documents some of what you saw while you were out there in New York. And the reading last night was really fun. I think, I'm struck that when what you shared with us was more of the sequential comics, that had that sort of classic Julia Wertz sense of humor. And you kind of use that as the inroads to what a lot of the book is, which is like, really getting into the weeds of talking about New York City and the buildings and the history and that kind of stuff. And it was funny. And it's also kind of informative at the same time, which is, I think, what the book does. So I'm just curious how the publicity tour is going and what kind of reception you're getting to the book. What kind of things are you hearing from folks?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a tricky book because how you said, there's a sequential humorous comics and there's a lot of very dense history stuff. Yeah. And while I was sort of working on all this history stuff, my intention was to make it more palatable because history can be excruciatingly boring, right. Which I know because I read so many books on it, and it's just so few people. I know, I understand why. Because when I do long essays about history, it just somehow naturally just like sucks out any comedic value. It's really dry, and so I appreciate when people can do it humorously. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do. And when I do the readings for the events, I like to do the comics because that's what people are used to from me, but it also kind of eases them into the more pedantic aspect of the history stuff.
Yeah.
And I also don't want to get up there and just show people a bunch of drawings because it's kind of just uncomfortable for me and then boring for them. So it's, I try to sort of ease them into it a little bit, but hopefully they don't get the book and realize it's not all comics and are disappointed. So I could be shooting myself in the foot.
Well, one of the things we usually do with our guests when we have them on for an interview is either ask them to describe their new book, if they have a new book that's out and we're talking with them about that, or we do it instead. We describe what the book is about and then talk with the creator about it. But I think the subtitle of Tenements, Towers, and Trash, An Unconventional Illustrated History of New York City, kind of explains it all. It is a history. It is unconventional. You do things that are out of the ordinary when it comes to histories, graphic or otherwise. And is there anything to add to that to enlighten our readers who aren't familiar with this?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hodgepodge of things because it's like half comics about a funny historical event, half essays about like women of New York history, half a bunch of illustrations of then and now, cityscapes. And I think how they all sort of came about was just my personal interest in a story. And then I would take a story that everybody knows, say the World's Fair the World's Fair. Mm-hmm. Like the ruins are very well known in New York. Everyone kind of knows the history of the place. And then I would take that story and then see if I could put a different aspect to it. And that one just sort of fell into my lap because I was out in Pennsylvania. So I do a lot of urban exploring, which is exploring abandoned places. And I was in Pennsylvania. And I saw these lampposts at an old honeymoon resort. And I posted something about them on my urban exploring site. And over a year later, someone contacted me. And he was like, oh, my partner and I bought these lampposts and we're putting them up at our private airport. So I ended up tracing like where the lampposts went, kind of looking into the history of that after covering the general history of the World's Fair. So I was trying to find angles that people hadn't covered before. Mm-hmm. And with common histories. Like there's also one about Kim's Video, and everyone in New York knows about Kim's Video. It's like this very well-known video store with an eclectic collection, and it was open for many years. There's a couple of locations. But as I was researching it, one ex-employee mentioned Matt Morello, who said he was responsible for the collection, but no other history said that. So I ended up trying to do as much research as possible, and I couldn't find anything. So I hunted down Matt Morello just by like a hashtag on someone's Instagram, and went to his friend, and his friend hooked me up with him. And it turned out that like the entire collection of these videos was his responsibility. He started it all. It wasn't Mr. Kim, as people say. And I just was like, well, that's crazy. Like, no one talks about you in all these histories. No one gives you the credit for it. So I just went down a rabbit hole of talking to him and researching the whole collection. So that's what I try to do in all of them. I tried to find something that people hadn't talked about before and then get into that. So that's where the sort of unconventional part comes from.
And, you know, I think the word that you used a while ago, hodgepodge, goes a long way of describing how to approach, how you approached this project and how readers should approach it in terms of what to expect. Because, you know, with a lot of histories, there are, you know, either inherent or even imposed narratives, right? So you have a sequential storyline. With Tenements, Towers, and Trash, though, one of the things I really enjoyed about this is that there are bits about things like, you know, Kim's videos or, you know, the, you know, various bars or cigar shops of New York and whatnot. And then interspersed among those sections, which could last anywhere from, let's say, 1 to 4 or 5 pages, are your kind of like then and now illustrations, which I really love. And those are sprinkled throughout the book, where you will focus on a particular street address or a corner and show what it looked like maybe at the turn of the century or in the 1920s, 30s, or 40s, and then what it looks like at some point within the past, let's say, 10 years. And I think that that's very useful to intersperse those then and now segments, because they kind of work as connective tissue for the various topics concerning New York and you know, your experience with New York that really make up the core of the book.
I'm glad you appreciate that, actually, because there was some debate on how to lay the book out. And whether or not to intersperse them like that or to kind of collect them more thematically. And I fought for just having it kind of messy, where it's just like some loosely tie into the next story and some don't. Because when I was drawing it, I wasn't thinking about layout at all. I was just drawing what I wanted to draw. And then when we put the 300 pages together, we realized nothing really made sense sequentially. And to try and force it to make sense didn't work, because then it just put a whole bunch of then and now together. And that just visually was too cluttered. So it was just kind of like, fuck it. Like, let's just put everything in there, just sort of however I want to do it. But yeah, I tried to connect them to the story that's next. So just to give people a setting.
Yeah. And I think that casual approach is appropriate when you're talking about New York. I mean, I used to live in New York, and one of the best ways of finding out about things or places or events or people is just doing it in an unplanned way, right? You're walking down the street and you see this shop or this restaurant, and I didn't know that was there before. I'll have to go and check it out. So these kind of casual discoveries are similar to kind of like the casual nature, if we want to call it that you take in the layout of the new book.
Yeah, I mean, it very much reflects sort of how I discovered New York. And it doesn't, there's a lot of abandoned places and other city locations that I didn't include. So it's almost just like the first few years of my like really discovering the city and how it looked. Otherwise the book would be like 1,000 pages. But yeah, I mean, I didn't draw anything with an order in mind. I didn't look up histories with an order in mind. So it just made sense to kind of be like, I mean, here's all of it. And history is not clean and neat. Neither is the way it works. So we might as well just let it reflect that.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, there's a there's a kind of sense of whimsy about it. And you dig into, you know, whatever, as you were saying, like rabbit hole turns up as you walk along the streets or whatever. That brings to mind for me, like, I like that you have this list of things that were made in New York, and you start by talking about toilet paper, the Tom Collins potato chips, and Jell-O and Cronuts, which I think is so perfectly Julia Wertz. Yeah, so I mean,
it makes me so mad.
I didn't even know about cronuts until I read that section of your book.
There's no reason anyone should know about. They shouldn't even be a thing. You know what? I've never had one though.
Well, good. Good for you.
Yeah, I held out. I totally just didn't want to wait in line, and now they're not even trademarked. So I think they're at Dunkin' Donuts.
Okay, they're probably everywhere. Hopefully, as you talk about, nobody's paying $5,000 for a box of those things.
Oh yeah, the black market of cronuts. I mean, good for people making a scam however they can, but
whatever you got to do to make it.
Yeah, I've never made $5,000 selling a pastry, so who am I to scoff at anybody?
You know, another thing about Tenements, Towers, and Trash is that it's strikingly different from most, if not all, of your earlier works. You know, as you point out in your introduction, there are moments where you, I guess, come on screen, so to speak. In other words, you create sequential narratives where you yourself are a character. But the majority of the book is more of kind of an objective history where you, as narrator, when you come into play, you nonetheless are, let's say, off panel. And so it's not necessarily a book that I would call autobiographical in any way. I mean, your other books like, you know, Drinking at the Movies, The Infinite Wait, your various Fart Party comics. I mean, those are more autobiographical in nature, but you resisted that urge in Tenements, Towers, and Trash. And so I'm wondering, of those who, like, for instance, Janine Garofalo, who wrote the foreword to the newer edition of Drinking at the Movies, those fans of yours who were used to a certain kind of comics art from you, from Julia Wertz, what have been their reaction to your history of New York?
It's been mixed, and I understand why. The reason I excluded myself from this is mostly just I got so sick of myself. I was just like, I can't wake up and make another comic about myself. Like, I'm just everything. Everywhere I turn, it's just me. And I got so sick of it. So I started doing this project, and it was just like, it made sense to me. I was just like, this isn't about me at all. So I can just kind of turn off my brain and work on this history stuff. But some people, and they've not said this to me directly, I just see this stuff because I have a Google alert set for my name, which I don't recommend for anyone in the creative field. They'll just say stuff like, it's not funny. Why did she go off on this aspect? Like, it's the autobio stuff was working for her. This isn't going to work. But I don't know. I don't feel like I am beholden to anyone's idea of what they think I am. And so, I'll just do what I want to do, and it makes sense for me. I am going back to autobio stuff, but it's sort of like when someone, I think that when people are disappointed about it, they kind of have that attitude, when you know a band, and then the band gets bigger, and then you're like, I don't like them anymore. Their stuff sucks. It's mainstream. And I definitely don't think that my history stuff is mainstream by any means. I wouldn't compare it to that, but it's different, and it disappoints people, I guess, who want what they've been reading for the last 10 years. And I understand that, but also I don't care. It's I should be able to work on whatever I want to work on.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I forget who said this, but they're saying if I wanted to make the same thing over and over, I can't remember the quote. It was a good one. It was basically if you want to evolve and you don't, you're stopping yourself creatively. What's the point of even making art if you're then just making it for an audience who expects what they expect, and what they expect is the same thing you've always done. If that works for people, that's great. And then you should ride that train as far as you can, but it didn't work for me anymore.
Yeah, I do feel like there's something about Tenements that seems like the natural next thing after Infinite Wait and Drink at the Movies, because in both of those, it's memoir, and it's humorous memoir. But you Drinking at the Movies, you kind of draw these floor plans of your apartments, and you talk about your lived experience in New York. And so there's this whole feeling where even though there's less memoir or less of yourself in Tenements, it has much more of the object of what you've been into, like what you've been looking at when you're walking through the streets, which you depict a lot in your earlier books. So it feels like a natural thing. Like, I want to know what she's been thinking about and drawing all this time. And, that shows up here in this book, which is great.
Yeah, well, good. I'm glad you see it that way and you're not disappointed by it.
No, I agree. I think that both the new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash, and Drinking at the Movies especially, are great companion texts, whereas one, Drinking at the Movies, is focused on New York, but the gaze is turned inward. With Tenements, Towers, and Trash, it's outward that you're looking. And there are moments where you come into the narrative or the history that you're discussing, but it's mostly about that stuff that is outside of yourself. And so, I think it's great to get out of your comfort zone and do something very different, like Tenements.
Yeah, and also to do that book, I physically got out of my comfort zone too. I kind of quit comics for 2 years and just did a lot of urban exploring all around the United States, especially on the East Coast. And I didn't realize I was gathering material for any future thing. It was just I thought I was doing the opposite. I was like, I'm not doing anything that's related to art or comics. And, that was a lot of going from sitting at my desk daily and drawing all day and all night to being out walking through woods to get to abandoned places, through swamps, through weird Louisiana swampland to get to an abandoned plantation, running around abandoned asylums. It was totally different than what I was used to. Very much out of my comfort zone, but I loved it. And then I don't know, I never figured out how to make the two exist together though. I was urban exploring and then I went back to drawing and kind of quit the exploring thing. And every once in a while I'll pick up the exploring thing again and I'll stop drawing. I don't know how to do them at the same time and I think it's because they're just so different.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah. But I just feel like they merge together so well, though, because even as you're, describing the research you did or the history of a place or something like that, your same kind of wry tone is there. And so having it framed, as Derek was saying earlier, with these, different segments that are about you or about what you discovered or the story of you at the apothecary or whatever, it all just kind of frames it really well. So,
yeah, I have to shove myself in there somehow. I can never that totally excludes me because that's what I know. They always say write what you know, which is what I've always done, and that's what's always easy. So even when I'm writing history stuff, I'm still kind of putting myself in there and writing what I know, which makes the rest of the writing easier.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad in this book that you didn't take the approach that suggests overall that things were better in New York City then, whenever then was, than they are now. There's some places around the city, maybe like Times Square, that, now can be a little more nauseating. And you do think, wow, I wish, things were like they had been back in the 1970s and 80s. But especially in your then and now illustrations, right, of certain addresses or corners, you do show that in certain cases, the more contemporary example may be a little more rundown and less attractive, let's say. But I think in most instances, you show a variety of residences and businesses and whatnot that are thriving today, just as others had in the same location decades, if not a century ago. So, I do like that. I think it's easy to fall back on the old argument when it comes to urban spaces that, things are gentrified and they're not as good as they had been. You don't take that tact.
No, and I understand why people feel that way, and I sort of did when I first started this book, because when you appreciate old architecture and old things, and you walk around a city and see a lot of new architecture, it is very easy to be like, everything new is terrible, and everything old was so lovely, but the more I looked at the city and thought about cities and the history of them, the more I realized, just because I think something is unattractive, like a giant tower, doesn't mean some of them are really ugly. Some of them are terrible. But there is an aspect of it that's beautiful to somebody. There's a lot of design put into it. And sometimes the historical buildings they replaced had to come down because they're old. People couldn't live there. it sucks when, a place comes down and then they put up just a high-rise tower that's condos or something. There are certainly plenty of examples where they've taken down a lot of beautiful buildings and put up something that's inarguably gross. But the nature of cities is to change. If it all stayed the same, we'd be living in a pile of ruins. So change has to happen in order to make a city sustainable. Sometimes that change is ugly. Sometimes it's really cool. But that's just the natural progression of a city. And if I don't know, there's some people who are just so enamored with the past. And I think I said this actually at Pegasus last night, Paul. This is a repeat for you, but the past for New York and everywhere kind of was disgusting. Like the 1800s, the whole city was full of trash. Everyone dumped their, they would go to the bathroom in a chamber pot and just dump it out the window. The streets were full of sewage. Everyone was getting sick because of it. So we have this idea of the past being so romantic and everything's hand done and it's beautiful, but it was disgusting. It was literally living in a landfill. And so to not really recognize that it sort of reveals how much people have ignored about the uglier parts of history. And same with Times Square in the 70s. It was cool, it was gritty, but do you really want to walk down the street and get your purse stolen and get stabbed? Nobody actually wants that. We want it in the romantic ideal of a gritty New York and everything was kind of shady and there were prostitutes all around. But do you really want to walk down that street on your way to work?
Right.
I mean, yeah, I don't want to walk anywhere near Times Square now because it's so crowded.
Right.
But it doesn't mean, Times Square it's the tourist part. You just, you make a circle around it in your mind. It's for tourists and then you can kind of avoid it. I still like walking through it just to see, just the massive amounts of people. But it doesn't mean I don't know. There's a sort of nostalgia for the mud, I guess, or nostalgia for the past that people don't really understand. So someone had asked last night, what era I would go back to. And I was saying there's certain ones I would want to visit for a short period of time, but I wouldn't want to stay because everything was horrible and gross. And
4 hours years ago.
Yeah, I'd duck in and look at some hand-done signs or something, visit some stores. There was certainly a pride in stores that I don't see today. Apothecaries were really there's people poured their heart and soul into making these stores beautiful things you could go into. But also that was just a fraction of it. It's sort of like today where there would be a store where everyone puts a lot of work into it and then just next to it it's just a dumpy bodega that you think is probably a front for something else. But in the future, we're just going to know about the nice store. So it's not like everything was so nicely laid out and the architecture was so lovely. There were definitely shitholes here and there. So also that was only 200 years. Not a lot of time has passed. So,
right.
Everything's pretty much the same.
Yeah. I do like that you neither, I think over nostalgize, nor do you romanticize the present too much. It's a really good, this is what it's like in the city. There's great things about change and there's terrible things about change. I do think you have a kind of a special place in your heart for the holdouts. You have a section about holdout buildings. You talk about the Hess spite triangle. What is it about those kind of holdout things that you felt like you wanted to document?
I think I just like the attitude about it, where someone's like, "This is my building. I'm not changing anything, and you can grow the city around me." Right. So yeah, with the holdouts, especially the one where they built the tower up. And then they built it over. So it goes over the airspace of the holdout building. And I just like the idea of two fractions of war where one person's like, I'm not going. The other person's like, well, we'll just build around you. And you can look at it and be like, oh, that's horrifying. This tower just went up and over and it ruined everything for this building. Or you can look at it and be like, that's crazy. That is a crazy thing for everybody involved. The holdout said no to millions of dollars. The people with the tower and with the millions were just like, well, fuck you. We're doing what we want. Right. And it's horrible. And that's what's amazing about a city. That doesn't happen in other places where there's space. Right. So it's fascinating to see, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. The city is so much things piled on things that create these effects of oh, why would you do that? why would any rational person or, corporation do that? But there's different rationality in the city, right?
Yeah, and just because there's such a lack of space, it forces people to do some really bizarre things with architecture, and I appreciate it, even though it might be terrible.
Speaking of change and holdouts, one of my favorite sections of your book is, I guess, in the first quarter, where you spend quite a number of pages. This is one of the longest sections, going over a variety of bookstores in the city. And you point out that you have a particular fondness for bookstores. And so I'm guessing that's why this section is so long. It's also one of the most text-heavy parts of this book, which again, I really appreciate. And but there's a sense of, I guess, regret when you mention that one of these bookstores had either, let's say, recently closed, or maybe they closed during the writing or right after the writing of Tenements. So, there's something about a bookstore when it goes that, I don't know, for me at least, seems to be a heavier tug on the heart than if other residences or businesses or buildings were tore down or went out of business.
Yeah, well, as a reader and a writer, obviously bookstores have a special place in my heart, but I think it's especially difficult when they close down, because often they're not replaced by something valuable, like they become like cell phone stores or something.
Yeah.
And I've always seen bookstores as, I don't know, it's a sense of there's a sense of community at a bookstore, much more so than any other just regular market or bodega. Mm-hmm. So when it disappears, it's sort of like that a little bit of the community has gone, and it's sort of become a little bit, depending on what replaces it, a little bit more soulless, I guess. And also just, it sucks for authors in general, because I like to tell people to buy my books at a bookstore, because then they support me and the bookstore. And when the bookstore is gone, they're going to go to Amazon, and I don't particularly want people supporting Amazon. So it's like, I don't know, I probably shouldn't say that, since it is helpful if people buy it from Amazon and not. This is terrible, but buying used books is like the worst thing you can do for an author. It helps, but I buy all my books used, so I shouldn't. I'm such a hypocrite. And I love used bookstores. They're my favorite, because then I can actually afford things. But there's just sort of, something about a bookstore, especially an independent one, where whatever you buy there supports a multitude of people who are creating and selling and keeping a community going. So, yeah, when they disappear, it's really sad. And over the course of drawing this book for 2 years, I think at least 3 bookstores I had drawn went out of business. So, thank God I wasn't drawing this book for 10 years, because then the book would be completely obsolete. By the time it came out, everything would be gone. But like I said, that's just part of the city, I guess. But yeah, bookstores bum me out when they go out.
Well, in terms of your comparison and contrast of certain parts of the city, like say today or the time that you lived there to let's say decades ago, where did you go, or what did you use for reference to the way a particular address or location looked, let's say, in the early part of the 20th century?
So there's a website called oldnyc.org, and they pull from the public library archives, and it's locational. So you can like hit a dot and it'll pull up 5 photos of that location. And they just turned it into an app, and it wrecked my life. Like, I love it so much that I can't. When I was in New York a few weeks ago, I like to walk everywhere. And so I would say, I have an hour to walk to this place. That's what the map says. And then it would take me 3 hours. Like, I couldn't get anywhere on time, because it just, every corner you go to, there's photos. So I use that a lot. Unfortunately, because old photos are often really crappy, I would have to scan it in and then like zoom in on Photoshop and try and see what was there, and then draw it, based on a really blurry, pixelated image of what was there. So I tried to use only photos where I could see clearly and tell exactly what was there, so I could get the most accurate representation. But every once in a while, I wouldn't know what a store was, so I would just have to guess that it was probably a cigar store, because those were everywhere. So there were like a small handful of buildings or just stores. The buildings I got accurate, but I had to kind of budget a little bit.
And there is a section of your book devoted to cigar stores.
Yeah, just because that one came about just because one of them is an Apple store now, and I just wanted. Yeah, I tried to pick for the then and now. I tried to pick ones where there's definitely remnants of the then cityscape, so you can actually compare them. But I would throw one in that was completely different, where the building had been demolished and become an Apple store, just because I know that it always gets people. Like every time I show it, they're like, "Oh no!" So I'm like, "Okay, I'll put that one in there."
This is kind of a dumb question, but I think there's a deeper question within it, which is, you had to draw a lot of bricks and, and arches and a lot of architectural detail. And so, the dumb question is, why not just put the photographs in there? I think deeper embedded in it is the thought, like, what do you think it does to these spots to represent them in ink, and to kind of painstakingly recreate them as you draw?
I think because old photos are so visually singular, they're old, they all kind of look the same, they're all the same, they're black and white or they're sepia. So I think a lot of them are crappy. And so to bring it to life and actually show it in full, also for a lot of them, it'd be like a big photo and I would just zoom in on part of the neighborhood that someone might miss when they're looking at the photo and then adjust the angle or completely redo the angle and like pull that forward. So the drawing actually doesn't exist as just a photo anywhere because I would mess with the angles and zoom in. And it just kind of, because it visually is similar to the now version of it, I think it's just easier to see exactly what things became as opposed to, I don't know, when I look at old photos, like they're cool, but they all kind of look the same after a while. So does art, but I'm just so used to seeing old photos, but not seeing those old photos illustrated. So, because I'm an illustrator and a cartoonist, that was just the natural way to show it. It was the more laborious way. I don't think I could have put out a book of photos because there's so many already. So I don't think anyone was interested in publishing that. I think it only makes sense to do a book of illustration because that's not as common.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there's some topics, like for instance, your section on Bottle Beach, where you rely heavily on photographs, and also the one on Staten Island and the boat graveyard. And so I'm wondering what went into the decision to include the photos with those sections as opposed to illustrating as you do throughout most of the book.
Sure. Yeah, I know that was kind of an odd choice. I know that NPR did not like that. They were like the only people that said it.
Screw NPR.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reviewer for NPR too, hated New York, so it was weird. But I think at that point I should have maybe put more photos just to balance it out. But there's an aspect of abandoned things that I think in drawing it doesn't work. Like it doesn't bring it to life. It kind of mutes it and makes it really flat. So I wanted to put those photos in just to really show people like, hey, this exists. It's not just, a photo that I've zoomed in and blown up and changed. Like here it is actually as it appears. And I don't have an interest in doing that for buildings that still exist. It's only for the abandoned things. And I do have plans to do a book that have more photos in it for that reason. Like in some aspects, I think photos do the place a lot more justice than a drawing does. And I think that that's true with abandoned things because part of it is seeing exactly what happened to the place and exactly how it looks, not an artist's interpretation of it. If that makes sense. Yeah.
Plus that scary clown photo, that scary clown toy. You pretty much have to see that.
Yeah, I'm gonna have nightmares about that.
Someone actually found a old gun out there that had washed up.
Wow.
Thing. Yeah, and I had a friend who found some binoculars. Like you can find some real weird stuff out there, but the children's toys are definitely the most upsetting.
Now, Julia, I'm wondering if over the past several weeks you've been in communication with Roz Chast.
Yes. Roz, this whole book sort of exists because of her, because she's the one who got me the gig at the New Yorker. I went up to her house a couple years ago to meet her. she had read one of my books and we've been in contact, and I was like so starstruck because I've adored her forever. She has a lot of birds, and she has a parrot who, I don't know why, but whenever a guest is talking, it doesn't do this when she's talking, but every time I would start talking from the next room, it would go, "Shut up." It was so funny. But yeah, so yeah, I didn't realize at the time that she was working on a book about New York. We figured it out afterwards, and I didn't realize it was like coming out on the same day. And it was this whole thing. And we even used the same E.B. White quote, which is unfortunate, but I guess when I was talking to her about it, I was like, "I didn't know you were using that quote. I'm so sorry." And she was like, "Look, there's plenty of room enough for both of us. There are 1,000 million books about New York. Like, having two come out at the same time is nothing. Like, the city's enormous. There's plenty of room for everything." So yeah, it's been interesting. And also, we weren't able to do any events together because we were both way overbooked. And she also does she does like museum events. She's like where I want to be eventually with that kind of stuff. Yeah, I think she's fantastic, and I'm so glad that she did that book. And it is different; it's more of a personal angle for hers, so it's not the same, which is good. Otherwise that would be bad.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There is a difference in terms of your two approaches. It just is weird and even uncanny that these two books about New York City came out on the same day, and because Paul and I had the pleasure of talking with Roz about a week and a half ago for the Comics Alternative, and so I guess we're getting our dose of New York in October, right, Paul?
Absolutely. I do think that, that E.B. White quote from Here in New York that you were, Here's New York that you were talking about, the way that you quote that, White talks about three different possible perspectives: the native perspective, where you kind of take things for granted; the commuter's perspective, where it's just this hellhole, right? Mm-hmm. And then, but I think he really sees on that the third, which is the settler's perspective, where New York is this city final destination, and it's that perspective that brings all the like passion and all the curiosity to it. And I love that you have that tone. I mean, I love Roz's book as well, but your book definitely has that sense of fascination, of the sort of like wide-eyed, which is so how you draw yourself, but like that wide-eyed wonder at being in the city. Because you didn't come from there. You're a Northern Californian originally. So I think it's a great compliment, actually, to have the two books out at the same time.
Yeah, because she's a native. So I mean, I definitely don't think she has the cynicism that E.B. White is kind of implying natives have, or just being jaded. But it definitely, I do have that sort of like, oh, it's New York, what a wonderful city. And I certainly, if you spend 10 years there, you don't feel like that all the time. You play all the different roles. Like sometimes it's like, you're almost a native when someone's like, I've been here for 2 years. And you're like, I've been here for 10. And that feels like forever.
Right.
And then, if you're in the commuting position, you can just be like, this is the worst thing that ever happened to anybody if you're stuck on the subway full of people. But I never lost that sense of, New York is there's no other city like it. And people say that all the time. So it's not like a new thing. But having lived in other cities, like none of them really give me that sense of fascination. And just, I'll walk the same walk. For 10 years, I had this loop I did, and it was the same loop. It was just the quick one when I would like walk over the bridge in the city and I would go to the movies and then I would walk home. And there's no other city where I can walk the same exact walk and not get bored. And I think that's just, because the people and there's so much to look at. So I look at something different every time. But I've never been in a city, where I can do the same thing over and over and it doesn't drive me crazy because I hate repetition like that. But I can be very repetitive in that city and it's like a new thing every time.
Yeah. Well, something that you allude to in the introduction and then you come back to later in the book is what, or at least in a kind of a rough way, is, what caused you to not too long ago leave New York and move back to California. And it had to do with the apartment that you were renting. And in your section, I don't know, about halfway through where you're talking about New York architecture and different kind of apartments and you give layouts, which is really interesting. You're talking about how in your apartment in Brooklyn, you were only paying $800 a month for the place, which is really incredible at that time, especially. And then you say parenthetically something about your eviction. If you ask me privately, I'll totally tell you all the salacious details, I guess, that led to that conviction. And I thought in this interview, I'd take the chance and ask, are you willing to tell on this podcast some of those salacious details?
Well, first I'll say a little bit about that space. It was interesting because I'd been looking for apartments just on Craigslist, which is actually almost a dying thing to do. People don't do that so much anymore. And a listing had popped up and it said it was a basement apartment with no windows. And that's horrible. Like, I would never live in that situation. But it was $800, all including utilities. So $800 flat.
Wow.
And in New York, utilities can run you up to like $200 a month. So that's a good. So I was just like, I'll just look at it, see what Greenpoint's all about. So I went up there and we went down. It's like a sub basement, not a full basement, which means it's like 2 feet underground, and the rest is street level. But we go down and they open up the door and there's 3 huge windows facing out onto a really cute backyard, like full size windows, good light. And the lady was like, "Oh, I guess the listing was just wrong, but no one has come to look at it because the listing was wrong." And I was like, "Is it still $800? Like, this is a really cute. It's a studio, but it had a detached kitchen that was huge. The bathroom was huge, and then it had this room that was exactly the size of a queen bed. So it was like I didn't have to sleep in my living space. And it was fine. And they just gave it to me because no one else had come to look at it. Everyone thought it was just, I think now they could easily rent out a windowless basement apartment for $800. But, 10 years ago, not so much. Right. So I lived there, for 10 years. Rents were never raised. Oh, at one point toward the end, they raised it by $70, which was fine. Like my landlord, he would send his girlfriend down. He's Polish and he'd speak English. And she came down and she was like, "Can we raise the rent?" And I was like, "Are you asking me? Because no." And then she was really apologetic. And I was like, "Okay, well, how much?" And in my mind, I'm like, "Well, packing my bags because they figured it out." And it was only $70. So I was like, that's absolutely fine. They could have raised it by $300 and I would have stayed. But yeah, so, towards the end though, I guess the landlord had realized that he could renovate the place and charge everybody at least twice, if not more, for their buildings. And there were a lot of things that hadn't made sense while I was living there. I figured out halfway through that my unit was illegal because the fire department was doing an inspection, and I didn't lock my door because it was just in a basement and just into a hallway. It's just me. And the fireman just opened the door, and I screamed and he screamed because they were expecting it to be like a laundry room because no one should be living in the basement. Greenpoint's not zoned for basement use because the ground is really toxic. Wow. There was a really bad oil spill in a lot of factories there. And I'm sure if I ever get cancer, I'm sure I can trace it back to 10 years spent getting radon poisoning in a Greenpoint basement. But so he was like, "Oh, you're not supposed to be down here." And then he just slowly backed out and he was like, "I didn't see anything." Closed the door. And that was it. I never got in trouble or anything. But I did hear about a neighbor who had a similar setup and he got kicked out. The city found out his apartment was there and kicked him out. So it never felt quite as steady as a regular apartment should. Anyways, I was the only one who paid with a check. And what I didn't know is that everybody else in the building, all 3 units, including 2 other illegal ones, paid with cash. So when my landlord decided to evict everyone in the building, instead of just nicely asking us to leave, he decided he was going to drive us all out by yelling at everybody. Just being a complete monster. And it was very bizarre because I'd heard him yell at the upstairs neighbors before, but we had a good relationship for 10 years. He would bring me dented cans of cat food that he dug up in his basement from the cat, tomatoes from the yard. And then he just turned and he would just yell. And he tried to say I didn't put in an $800 deposit when I moved in. So I went down to the rental company to get the paperwork for it. And I said my address and my name. And they looked at their paperwork and they said, you didn't move out in 2008? I was like, no, I've been living there for 10 years. And they were like, is everybody else still there? I was like, yeah, it's like a building full of people. So what had happened is he had told the rental company in the city that he was giving the buildings, the apartments to family. So wasn't collecting rent, wasn't paying taxes. But I think what he was doing was he was collecting my rent in a check form and paying taxes only on my unit, which is why it was so cheap for 10 years. So he was staying on the radar, like not completely, sealing it off, but then not paying taxes for any of the apartments above, which were more expensive. So I don't know what happened with all of that, but they were really mad. I don't know really how that works with like the rental company, if they get some kind of perpetual kickback or whatever. But I asked them not to, tip his house of cards or whatever until after I left because I didn't know what would happen. And he was so mean at this point. So I never figured it out, but I hope he got some repercussion. I hope the IRS didn't get involved though, because that would bankrupt him. Like I don't want him to be ruined because he did give me 10 years of paying half the rent I should have been paying. And I'm very grateful for that. And I just, had he asked me to leave too, nicely, I would have, thanked him for that time and I would have been out the door, like immediately, in gratitude. But instead he just went a really nasty way. And I think he might have gotten himself in a lot of trouble, just because he decided to go that route instead of being nice. So I don't know. It's definitely, I've heard these stories before from people, so it's not uncommon. I'm sure he just gave them some cash under the table and is fine.
Yeah. That's interesting about urban businesses and dwellings. And I'm sure it's the same in other big cities like Chicago and what have you. When I lived in New York for a good bit of the time there, I worked at a cafe in Greenwich. And the owner was someone who was extremely difficult. But he did give me a job, so I'm thankful for that, especially when I had no New York waiting I had waiting experience, but not New York waiting experience, which everybody wanted.
So lucky then. Yeah.
So yeah, I was really lucky. I think he liked my look. He was of this kind of Irish descent, kind of tough, low to the ground, and he had at the same time a resentment of wasps, but at the same time a fascination. And I'm a white guy of English origin, and even though I'm not anything other than middle class, he kind of looked up to me as something like he wanted to be, and I think that's why I got the job, because I was clean cut. But anyway, I mentioned this because there were some employees that he paid like officially with checks, but there were a number of us who only got paid in cash. And I always wondered about that. And a lot of businesses do that, and landlords, I guess, do that because of, any number of reasons having to do with money. But, it's something that I hadn't experienced before. So I always wondered, okay, what was going on with this guy? And so I kind of fantasized this kind of illegal aspect of his life that went much further than just paying some of us under the table.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Once you figure out it's kind of like pulling the thread and then it all comes unraveled, and it's always runs much deeper than you think. I mean, I've definitely, and only in cities has this happened. I've had it like in San Francisco, I had a job where they paid me by personal check, which that's not really a thing. And I never paid taxes. I never filled out any paperwork. It was like, I just showed up when they were like, you want a job? Here's a personal check once a month. And then in New York, I had a couple of jobs where I would just get a till, which is like a flat, these are bartending jobs, like a flat $20 per shift, which sounds terrible, but then you make a bunch in tips, and that's how you end up making it. But I figured out with the bar in New York, on paperwork, what they would submit is that only the owner and his co-owner they would say that they were the only ones tending bars. So they had no employees. So there was no, they didn't have to pay out any sort of employee benefits or anything, or write down on taxes that they had employees there. So it's just, they're just like saying they're single-handedly running this operation, which also happens a lot. So no one's going to question it. And that way they don't have to pay anything else. And I don't mean to say they don't have to, because they can't, a lot of these businesses just flat out can't. They would go out of business immediately. So that's just how things work. And sometimes there's an envelope of cash involved when an inspector comes in, and that's just how it goes.
Yeah.
One of the things that you do in the book that I like that, us talking about this reminds me of is when you talk about Ray's Pizza and all the different Rays that have existed and the little, takeoffs of Rays and stuff. And I love the parts where you're narrating this stuff that may have been going on behind those doors, the stories you hear about mobsters and, this and that and whatever. And but you just keep drawing the facades of the Rays, and those are interesting in themselves. But it reminds me of the experience of walking through the city and looking at a restaurant or a store or something, and just imagining all that might be going on behind those doors. All the ways people have to figure out how to make it or work it or make a living and stuff.
For those pieces, I had considered making comics out of them, like the other history pieces. But first of all, I was drawing a lot of people, and I hate drawing people. But also, I just realized that if I only draw the facade, like only what I see and only what people see walking around, and then force people to sort of read the history through the text, it was almost like a shortcut to being like, this is how it actually feels to learn about the history of a place, but then only just see the building.
Right. Yeah.
And also it was easier to draw. So it's kind of a bonus.
Well, Julia, I'm curious. You mentioned that if you included everything you wanted to in a book like this, it would be over 1,000 pages. I'm wondering what things or what sections had you wanted to include in that were the most painful not to be able to put in Tenements, Towers, and Trash?
I think a lot of abandoned locations I wanted to put in, but then it would had I done that, it would have become a book only about abandoned locations, and that's not what I wanted, because I wanted to talk about the city. So I had to make a point of only putting in a few that I thought had mass appeal and that also people could go to. Because a lot of the locations I went to in the city, you can't go to them. It's really illegal. It's dangerous. So I didn't want to be irresponsible and put out a book that made it appear as if it was easy to go to those places, because it was nestled in between other places you can go. Like there's a feeling about it where it's like you can go to every location in this book. So I didn't want to mislead anybody. But those places that were so much fun to explore, they're so much fun to photograph. So to sort of ignore them hurt a little bit. But then I was like, you know what? This book is already its own thing. I can do those later, maybe with more photos. And also just other, I had spent the whole summer drawing Greenpoint, basically every single corner of Greenpoint as it was and as it is now. Probably about over 100 pages worth of Greenpoint, and only 6 pages of that made it into the book. So I'm just sitting on this artwork of Greenpoint, and I don't really know what to do with it. And but that was painful to be like, here's a whole summer's worth of work I'm just letting sit idle. But I don't know. I'll figure something out for it. So it's almost like, that book is just like the tip of the iceberg for me and what New York actually was for me, because there's just too much.
Well, you said earlier that you will return and continue doing the more autobiographical type comics, but do you see Tenements, Towers, and Trash as, I don't know, maybe a career, if not a turning point, then at least a significant shift in the kind of comics that you think you'll be doing from here on out?
That's a good question. I'm not really sure. It would be nice if I could keep doing stuff like this, because there's actually some money in this. So if I could, keep doing this to support my comics habit, sort of. I'm not to say that there's no money in autobiographical comics. That would be a lie, because I got to where I am now by doing those, but it's substantially less, and it's a lot harder to do that and to put out those books. So almost if I could keep doing it just as more for a financial reason, that would be nice. And just because I'm afraid of going back to only autobio and just sort of closing off those opportunities, I guess, because that really opened me up to a bunch of other things, and it made me want to see other cities and go travel around the United States and like look at a lot of history photos of other towns. Mm-hmm. And so if I just go back to autobio, I don't know, I feel like it would be closing off a very fun aspect of traveling and drawing and writing and talking to people. So I don't know, but I got to figure out how to balance it. So
yeah,
that's the challenge.
I love your autobio comics. They make me laugh, but there is this part of them that is always about what your fascination, your curiosity, your funny observations about things you see, and like this book is really seeing those things with you. And so I look forward to more of Tenements like stuff in your future work.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I'm glad you see it that way.
I do have to ask. You mentioned this in the story about going into the apothecary, and at first they're like, no photos in here, and you're like, hey, this is for the New Yorker, like that cred, you must be dropping that everywhere. Like, if do you go into a restaurant and just be like, yeah, I need a table because I'm drawing for the New Yorker or something like that? Oh my
God, I wish. I always think of that story where Picasso would pay for his dinners by like drawing on the napkin. Yeah. I'm like, how do I get that? But no. Yeah, I definitely drop it when I want access to a location that's private, and it usually works. And every time it works, I'm like freshly astounded. I'm like, what? Don't you know I'm like just a cartoonist? Like, but yeah, that was the first time I realized I was just sort of like sitting on a golden ticket of people saying yes or paying attention to me, I guess. And sometimes it's kind of gross. I recently visited a film set or a TV show set, and everyone there is really busy. They're doing their thing. I don't expect anyone to pay attention to someone's friend who's just on set. Mm-hmm. So I sat down like behind the director and some writers and kind of ignored, because they're busy. And then someone asked like what I was doing there. And I was there for a series of interviews I'm working on. And I said that, I'm working on these interviews. I work for the New Yorker. And then everyone like dropped what they were doing and turned around and looked at me. And I was like, hi, nice to meet you guys. You totally ignored me when I first sat down. Mm-hmm. I didn't say that, but that was very much what happened. And so it's a weird experience to then have people treat you differently. Right. And I don't have like a distinguished presence. So when I come into places or go to parties or literary events, no one assumes I'm anyone of importance. Mm-hmm. So it's just then very funny to watch people react differently, and also then I totally judge them. I'm like, and no, I cannot do anything for your career now. So,
yeah.
Julia, I think it's worth mentioning that this week, the paperback edition of a book you do illustrations for, the Emotionary, a dictionary of words that don't exist for feelings that do, came out. The hardbound came out a year ago, but now the paperback came out this week.
Yes, that was actually the TV set I was on. I was visiting Eden Cher. Now I feel bad because I feel like I talk shit about people there. Everyone's actually lovely. But so Eden Cher is on a show called The Middle, which she won't mind my saying this either, but like no one in our demographic watches it.
What's it called?
Really The Middle.
Oh, The Middle.
It's been on for 9 years now, 9 seasons. It's on like a major network. It's very popular, but not with people not with like city people or with like people in our 20s and 30s. Mm-hmm. I'm not in my 20s. I don't know why I said my 20s or 20s. But it's a very sweet show, and I've always watched it while I watch a lot of TV while I work. And I like the aspect of it. It's a family show, and it's on a major network, so it's super clean. And I always admire comedy that can be sweet and clean, but also good. I feel like that's such a fine line to walk. So when she emailed me a few years ago, she was like, "You have no idea who I am or like what the show I'm on is, but I like your work, and I would love if you illustrate my book." And I was like, "I do know who you are because I'm the only person our age who watches that show." And so her and I became friends. I illustrated the book. I visited her in LA a few times. She's a delightful person, and she's so smart. So I love just the angle of her book it is YA, but it's definitely not really for young adults. It's very much for a very neurotic older adults. So yeah, it was a pleasure to illustrate and write comics with her. It was like, and then again, it wasn't about me, so it was a nice break. And she also sort of got me back into drawing, because she had emailed me at a time when I was doing all the urban exploring stuff, but it was kind of winding down and I wasn't sure what to do, and I wanted to get back to drawing, but I didn't have a project that was really calling to me at that point. And she just happened to email me then, and I got right to work, and I've been at work ever since.
That's cool.
Yeah. Well, I know that you're doing the publicity and the speaking engagements for this new book. What are you working on right now in terms of comics, if anything, that you can tell us about?
Yeah. I'm taking a bit of a break just because it's so much work to do PR for this book. Mm-hmm. Yeah, once you end a book like this, it's like, oh, I can kick back and be done. But then all this other stuff happens that behind the scenes in order to make it keep going. I did some stuff, some comics about my mom for the New Yorker recently, and I'm going to do a couple more of those. I'm supposed to be working on a book that's a follow-up to Drinking at the Movies that's going to come out with Quama Press in 2019. But I haven't quite gotten back on track with that one, so I'm just kind of stepping back a little bit and just taking a breather and organizing stuff that, I put off organizing for years, a lot of photos and stuff. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, just kind of sitting here, working all day, but then I'm not quite sure, like, at the end of the day, what I actually worked on, even though I've been working all day. So it's a weird place to be. I would like to get back to, regular drawing.
And yet, you as you document in Drinking at the Movies, those times when you took a step back and weren't really sure exactly what you were doing or why you were doing it is exactly what led to the gold that's in this book. So, and that's in Tenements and Tower. That sort of like, let me just capture what's around me, and taking a step back and gaining some perspective. And I think it wound up, leading you to a kind of documenting and preserving of the place that you were at and what you saw around you. That's just awesome. That's really enjoyable. So
thank you. Yeah. I mean, I guess it does help me think now, like, no time is wasted, basically. Like, I've been doing a lot of mini road trips this year. I managed to make a 12-hour drive from Washington to California take 4 days. Because they kept stopping so much and going off on other little highways and looking at these old buildings and abandoned things. And again, I was like, I'm just wasting so much time. But then I remembered that's also what I thought during the urban exploring years. Mm-hmm. And, unfortunately, you don't get paid to waste that much time. So it can definitely catch up with you real quick. But no time is wasted, basically, if I can use it in the future somehow. Trying to rephrase it. But financially, those 2 years were challenging.
Yeah. Well, they may have been challenging, but those urban exploration years definitely have provided us with a great read in this new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash.
Well, good. I'm glad someone's reaping the benefits.
Yes, we have a different take on it than the NPR people.
Good, because they were very negative.
Yeah.
Actually, just wanted to slip in a last thing. One of the things, Julia, you said last night at the book at Pegasus was just a shout out to Brian Fees, and I really appreciated that. And so I thought we might as well take a shot. Derek's mentioned it on the podcast, but Brian Fees, whose home was, I think, consumed by the wildfires here in Northern California, and I think he has a piece in the Santa Rosa Press Democrat that just came out about that. But you mentioned it, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I also just saw it was on Mother Jones. Yeah, he lived in the coffee neighborhood of Santa Rosa. They were evacuated really fast overnight, and he didn't get any of his artwork. And I just can't even imagine losing a whole, that's just hurts my heart to even hear. But yeah, his book, Mom's Cancer, is really good. And like I said, Pegasus, I think the best way to support people when that happens is to buy their work, and to buy it at a local bookstore. So go buy Mom's Cancer and read his work. It's really good.
That's right. On our next, I guess, November webcomics episode, we're going to be discussing, among other titles, his webcomic about having that going through that experience.
Yeah, he kicked that out so fast. I was very impressed. It would take me like a year to even draw again if my house burned down, and he just went right to work.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and it's very good. It's great. It's very like immediate and raw, which makes it really good.
Well, Julia, we want to thank you for taking the time and being on the Comics Alternative and talking about your new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash. It's been a joy, and it gives Paul and I yet another opportunity, along with our recent conversation with Roz, to talk about New York.
Well, yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for listening to me talk about it.
This was fun. Derek, I want to thank you for bringing me on to this conversation, because I thoroughly enjoyed meeting Julia, thoroughly enjoyed reading her work. I think it's great fun, and I just really encourage folks out there, if whether you have or have not enjoyed, Drinking at the Movies or Infinite Wait, to check out Tenements, Towers, and Trash. It's really good stuff.
Yeah, and you said you had a fun time meeting Julia. Not only did you get to meet her over Skype as we recorded this, but you met her in person last night, and it's something I wish I had the opportunity to do.
Oh yeah, she was super, super nice. Yeah, and really the whole crowd was in stitches listening to her read the comics. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I don't think on her publicity tour she's going to come anywhere near the Piedmont area of the Carolinas. But if she does, hey, I would be there.
Yeah.
But I think it's good enough to have read Tenements, Towers, and Trash, and we recommend that our listeners pick it up as well.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, unfortunately, you can't get this right now, at least, from the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. But you can get a lot of other things at wonderful discounts at dcbservice.com. So definitely go there and check them out. But if you go to comicsalternative.com/Amazon, you'll see an image of the two guys saying, get your Amazon.com stuff through us. And if you click on that, then do a search for Julia Wertz, and you will find a great discount, 27% off, not only her new book, Tenements, Towers, and Trash, but you can also get her other works like Drinking at the Movies, The Infinite Wait and Other Stories, The Fart Party Volume 2. So a lot of Julia Wertz's books on Amazon.com. But if you do that, please be sure that you go through our site, that is comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click on that icon and then do your Amazon.com shopping, because whatever you get with that visit will throw a few cents back to us. So you'll be taking away from Bezos and giving to the two guys with PhDs. So feel good about yourself and your favorite podcast.
That's right.
And after you do get your comics at either dcbservice.com or through us at Amazon, get in touch with us and let us know what you thought about our conversation with Julia Wertz. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can get in touch with us by email, 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can email Derek at derek@comicsalternative.com, and I'm at paul@comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can find us all over social media and get in touch with us that way. We're on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. And you can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right.
Yeah, and we do like to hear from you, and we do have more interviews and, of course, more review episodes in the days to come, so check back for those. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Paul. Let's keep on reading.